until I'll be back.
Okay. Good morning. The committee will come to order. We are meeting today to consider H.R. 807, the Full Faith and Credit Act introduced by Congressman McClintock earlier this year. I'll be offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute to ensure that the United States never defaults on a debt payment. In February of this year, the President signed into law H.R. 325, the No Budget, No Pay Act, which suspended the debt limit until May 19, 2013. House Republicans approved that legislation to allow the President and congressional Democrats time to join us in proposing credible solutions to rein in Washington's out-of-control spending. While it forced Senate Democrats to produce their first budget in 4 years, the result wasn't pretty. That budget, like the President's, never balances, fails to address the primary causes of our debt and deficits, and simply piles more debt on the backs of our children and grandchildren. The rating agency Standard & Poor's was crystal clear as to why it downgraded the U.S. credit rating, and I quote, "The downgrade reflects our opinion that the fiscal consolidation plan that Congress and the administration recently agreed to falls short of what, in our view, would be necessary to stabilize the government's medium-term debt dynamics. In plain English, S&P downgraded the U.S. credit rating because we've not addressed the primary drivers of our debt and deficits. It's nearly 2 years later, and neither the President nor congressional Democrats have offered a serious plan that would address the problems that caused the downgrade in the first place. So with Washington again about to hit the debt limit, we're still faced with the same old problem, getting Washington's spending finally under control. While Americans want Washington to start living within its means, they also know the full faith and credit of this country must never be questioned. That's why the committee is considering this legislation, which clearly and credibly removes the threat of default, no matter what Washington does or fails to do. My amendment does not raise the debt limit. Instead, it requires the Department of Treasury to roll over existing debt by issuing debt outside the limit solely for the purpose of paying principal and interest on our current debt. Importantly, this legislation defines interest in a way that requires Treasury to make the interest payments necessary to ensure that Social Security benefits can be paid in full and on time. The consequences of a U.S. default on a debt payment could be very serious. A default would at the very least hinder an already stagnant economic recovery and in a worst-case scenario lead the country back into recession. Failure to make a debt payment will increase our borrowing costs and threaten our ability to make any of the payments we owe. If signed into law, this legislation would prevent such an unacceptable situation. The amendment before the committee today also removes a potential obstacle of Treasury's imposed inability to make debt payments before other obligations once the debt limit has been reached. Despite the fact that then Treasury Secretary Geithner was prepared to prioritize debt payments in the summer of 2011, there's been some confusion as to whether or not the Treasury Secretary has the authority or ability to enact such a plan. By requiring Treasury to issue debt to make these payments, this legislation provides an ironclad plan to avoid the risk of default going forward. Some will argue that failure to pay an obligation other than interest or principal on our debt is simply another form of default. However, two major credit rating agencies, Moody's and Standard & Poor's, have indicated that they distinguish between failure to make a debt payment and payment on another obligation of the United States. According to those agencies, it's unlikely that a failure to pay an obligation other than debt would prompt a review of the United States credit rating. This legislation also includes an important provision to hold the administration accountable when using the authority provided them in the bill. The amendment requires the Secretary of the Treasury to provide a weekly accounting to the Ways and Means and Senate Finance Committees of the amount of principal and interest due and amount of debt issued under this authority. In short, if they try to game the system, Congress and the American people will know. The President and Congress must work to reduce the growing burden of our debt and deficits, but we must do so without imposing more tax increases on hardworking families and job creators. There are bipartisan policies that we can enact to reduce wasteful Washington spending and preserve Social Security and Medicare for future generations. This committee has already begun to examine those policies and will continue to do so over the coming months. In the meantime, we must act to make it clear to the American people and the world economy that the U.S. will not default on a debt payment. The legislation before us accomplishes that important goal, and I'd urge my colleagues to join me in voting for its passage in committee today. And before I yield to the ranking member for any statement he wishes to make, I ask that all member opening statements be included in the record, and without objection so ordered. Mr. Levin's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry Treasury isn't here. They would completely refute the argument that has been presented. Indeed, despite the damage inflicted in our economy 2 years ago, and against the renewed warnings of economists. Republicans are once again steering our nation towards default. Indeed, they are preparing for default. That's what this bill is all about. Because let's be clear, prioritization by any name is default. You cannot cut default or full faith and credit in half. Treasury has made it clear that it's impossible to prioritize the bill it pays. Indeed, instead of playing with fire, the Republicans should fulfill their responsibilities and call a conference committee on the budget so that we can reach a budget agreement. Apparently, it has been forgotten by the proponents of this legislation that the last time Republicans turned our nation toward default, in the summer of 2011, the damage was serious and lasting. August 2011 was the single worst month for job creation in the last 3 years. The Dow Jones Industrial Average plunged 2,000 points in July and August of 2011. The Treasury was forced to spend $1.3 billion more in interest payments, according to a Government Accountability Office estimate. The Bipartisan Policy Center estimates the higher costs will be almost $19 billion over the next decade. And of course, who could forget that the U.S. credit rating was downgraded for the first time in our history? This legislation appears to have been designed to give the veneer of credibility to the notion that it might be appropriate, thinkable, or manageable to default on our debt. It is none of these. The Treasury makes 80 to 100 million payments per month, and their computer systems are set up to pay bills in the order they come in. Both the Bipartisan Policy Center and the Council of Inspectors General for Financial Oversight, as well as the department itself, and I emphasize that, have concluded that it would be simply impossible for them to pick and choose which bills get paid and which do not. Economists from across the political spectrum have further warned about the economic calamity that would ensue. Keith Hennessy, a former Bush administration economist, wrote that it would be, and I quote, the first step to becoming a banana republic, end of quotes, and would turn the economy into, I quote, a bloody mess. Another Bush administration official, Tony Fratto, said just about this kind of bill, I quote, prioritization is impossible, end of quote, and asked, in quote, is the government really going to be in the position of withholding benefits, salaries, rent, contract payments in order to pay off Treasury bondholders? Yet that's precisely what this bill aims to do. This default preparation legislation would allow Treasury to continue paying private bondholders, including Chinese investors, while perhaps having to default on salaries for our troops in harm's way, medical care for our veterans at home, or payments to American businesses. It would allow Social Security payments to continue by using its own money to pay earned benefits, but would perhaps force Treasury to default on payments to doctors and hospitals that serve seniors. August 2011 showed us the economic mess that results from playing games with the debt ceiling. For the sake of the nation, I urge my Republican colleagues to avoid repeating their mistakes.
Thank you. The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 807. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, which was distributed in advance, along with a green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for purpose of amendment. I will now turn to Mr. Warren Payne, the committee's policy director, to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. I would ask that members hold their questions until after his presentation. Mr. Payne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, the amendment in the nature of a substitute strikes all after the enacting clause and inserts the amendment. In general, the amendment provides the Treasury Secretary authority to pay principal and interest on the debt, notwithstanding the statutory debt limit. Section 1 of the amendment retains the short title from H.R. 807 as introduced by Representative McClintock. Section 2 requires that once the statutory debt limit has been reached, the Secretary of the Treasury shall issue debt to the extent necessary to pay principal and interest on certain obligations as defined, notwithstanding the debt limit. Section 2 defines the obligations for which new debt may be issued as those obligations held by the public or the Social Security trust funds. Further, Section 2 requires the submission of weekly reports by the Treasury Secretary to the Committee on Ways and Means and the Senate Finance Committee on the amount of principal and interest due and the amount of obligations issued pursuant to the authority granted in the amendment. Mr. Chairman, that completes my walkthrough.
Thank you. Are there any questions for Mr. Payne? Mr. Levin.
Mr. Payne, would you list the debt, the kinds of debts that are not covered by this bill?
Ranking Member Levin, the amendment in nature of substitute defines obligations in Section 2 of the bill.
But if you would, begin to list the kinds of debts not covered.
The amendment in nature of substitute provides for Treasury to have the authority to pay public debt and interest on the Social Security trust funds, and that is all it provides for.
So it would take hours, I think, to list what's not covered. Could you list the major debts not covered? Some of them.
Ranking Member Levin, the amendment in nature of substitute provides only for the authority to pay principal and interest on the debt and debt to the Social Security trust funds.
You don't want to answer my question?
I'm simply describing what's in the bill, sir.
Well, I'm asking you to describe what is not covered.
Those are the only things covered by the amendment, sir.
What isn't?
Anything not specified in the legislation, sir.
Would you like to give some major examples?
Ranking Member, I could randomly pick any policy or other debt instrument you might prefer to hear from, but as a technical matter, the legislation only provides for the authority for debt held by the public and debt held by the Social Security trust funds.
Do you have any idea what percentage of the debts are not covered?
We have not calculated that, sir.
Why not?
It's not within the scope of the legislation.
Well, what's within the scope is what's covered and what's not covered. Isn't that true? You have no idea as to the percentage of debts not covered by this legislation?
Ranking Member Levin, the United States Treasury pays all obligations out of a combination of revenue and additional borrowing associated with auctioning public debt. Roughly, approximately 60% of all obligations can be paid and are paid out of regular receipts and therefore don't require the issuance of any debt.
All right. Mr. Johnson is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have some questions for Mr. Payne, but before I get to them, I just want to say that as I meet with my constituents back home, I hear loud and clear their concerns about our record debt and deficits. We're nearly $17 trillion in debt. That comes out to over $53,000 per American. My constituents want Washington to get its fiscal house in order. Folks back home get it. They've had to make tough choices to live within their means. Washington shouldn't be any different. My Republican colleagues and I have been committed to getting our fiscal house in order, grow our economy, and get America back to work. In fact, just last month we passed a budget that responsibly balances. Unfortunately, the President's budget doesn't balance ever. Just look at page 183 of the President's budget. There are deficits year in and year out. What the President's budget offers is more spending and over $8 trillion in new debt. You need to look no further than the President's budget to see we have a spending problem not a revenue problem. You know the President's budget projects record tax revenues. However, under the President's budget, our country will go deeper into debt because the President wants to spend, spend, spend. American hardworking taxpayers and their children and grandchildren deserve better. We owe it to them to do the right thing and leave them a better America, not a mountain of debt. Mr. Payne, I have some questions for you regarding Social Security. Mr. Payne, does this bill allow Treasury to pay full promised Social Security benefits to seniors, survivors, those with disabilities, and their families?
Yes, sir, it does.
Seniors will get their checks, true or false?
Yes, sir, they will.
Those on disability will get their checks.
Yes, sir, they will.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, back in 1996, we passed similar legislation. Then Social Security was getting more in revenue than it was paying out in benefits. So full Social Security benefits could be paid without hitting the debt limit. Today, there aren't enough revenues to pay Social Security benefits. To make up the difference, Treasury has to redeem the debt it owes to Social Security by borrowing from the public. This may cause a small increase in the debt because when Treasury redeems Social Security IOUs, it must pay any interest accrued on that debt. Our bill exempts this increase from counting against the debt limit. According to CBO, the annual cash shortfall is projected to reach $77 billion this year, and by 2023, the shortfall will be $221 billion. The shortfall for the 10-year period ending 2023 will total $1.3 trillion. These cash shortfalls are permanent and are growing each and every year. Mr. Chairman, in closing, we owe to the American people to preserve and protect Social Security. I yield back.
All right, Mr. Rangel.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. It's my understanding that if we don't have a default, there's no need for this legislation, Mr. Payne.
Mr. Rangel, are you asking that if we increase the debt limit?
I am asking you that if we don't have a default, if we do increase the debt limit, which the president, and authorize the president to do that, there would be no need for this legislation.
Mr. Rangel, this legislation ensures that Treasury has the authority to make all principal and
Please
interest
don't
payments,
do to
whether
me what you've done to
whether we increase the debt limit or
younger
not.
than I am, and I need a little more respect for my age. So, don't do the same thing to me now. I'm saying that if the president is authorized to raise the debt ceiling, is there any need for H.R. 807?
The way the legislation operates, Mr. Rangel, is that it is only operative when we are up against the statutory debt limit. It would not operate if we are not actually at the debt limit.
Okay, that's a whole lot of words to say no. So we're preparing for a default. Is that true?
I'm sorry, sir, that's not a technical question. I probably shouldn't answer that.
We don't need this unless there's a default, and it doesn't come into effect unless there's a default. So we're planning for a default.
The legislation comes into effect when we are at the statutory debt limit, which is something that has happened relatively frequently in the course of the existence of the statutory limit.
Are you an attorney?
No, sir.
How long you been working with the committee?
I've been on the committee staff since 2007, sir.
With the Republicans only?
Yes, sir.
You know any Democrats? Do you talk with them? Or?
I think we're getting past the scope of technical advice on the legislation before
I
us.
just want to
But
see what makes
as
people,
interesting as it is.
Well, I just want to see what makes people talk that way, Mr. Chairman. I never heard anyone speak that way or answer questions that way, but I want to be compassionate and understanding. Now, would the debt that we owe to China, does that receive some type of priority under this bill?
No, sir, it does not.
Do foreign creditors receive priority under this bill?
No, sir, they do not.
Who gets paid first under this bill?
Mr. Rangel, the legislation would authorize or give the authority to Treasury to make all payments in principal and interest to all holders of public debt and to the Social Security Trust Fund.
Who gets paid first? If I'm a creditor, it scares me if I lend somebody some money and they're talking about what's going to happen as to who they got to pay first. It's like some people, they put all the creditors in a hat and they decide at the end of the month that they can pull out one or two of them and pay those, and the rest of the creditors, they just don't have enough money to pay. And I think this is what we're doing. We're telling all of our creditors that we have decided in the Congress which bills the United States of America is prepared to give priority. Is that a fair explanation of H.R. 807, that we're making a priority of certain debt and that other debt would not receive this priority? Is that what we're doing?
Mr. Rangel, there's nothing in the legislation that would instruct Treasury to prioritize payments.
Well, who's going to, why do they call this default privatization legislation? That's not what the legislation's called?
No, sir, the title of the bill is the Full Faith and Credit Act.
I see. Well, this default prioritization legislation, would you say it's not that? Is that a wrong thing to call this bill, that it gives priority to certain creditors? Does it give priority to certain creditors? Start to say counselor, but obviously that wouldn't apply.
There's nothing in the legislation, Mr. Rangel, that directs Treasury to prioritize payments.
So the Treasurer, notwithstanding this legislation, can continue to pay people as they pay everybody, as they normally would do, right? It has no impact on the President's authority to pay our creditors. Is that your opinion? I'm close to supporting the legislation, so think carefully.
Mr. Rangel, the legislation grants Treasury the authority to make all principal and interest payments as defined, irrespective of whether up against the debt limit. Beyond that, it provides no instructions to Treasury to prioritize.
All right, time's expired. Mr. Brady.
Son of a gun.
I don't know why anyone would oppose this legislation. My understanding is that it really reassures our investors that it assures our investors that America will make good on its debts. It takes this issue of default off the table so we can focus on the spending challenges in America, as well as what we need to do to act now together to save Social Security and Medicare for the long term. And in that default issue, Mr. Payne, can you talk about what default is and what the impact would be on borrowing costs, on our economy, on our credit rating as a country?
Mr. Brady, two of the major credit rating agencies, as the chairman indicated in his opening, Moody's and S&P, have indicated that for purposes of our country's sovereign credit rating, they will analyze whether or not Treasury has missed a debt payment, a principal and interest payment. If we were to do that, the rating agencies have indicated they could institute a ratings review, which could result in additional downgrade. The impact of a potential downgrade is obviously uncertain, but it could increase borrowing costs.
Are there any impacts on the economy should we default on our debts?
Mr. Brady, if there is a default, if the credit rating of the country is lowered and if interest rates rise, it could increase net borrowing costs, which would squeeze other government spending. It could disrupt interest rate transactions in the private market. So it could have a substantial spillover effect on the health of the overall economy.
Right now, we're generating for America, higher taxes and revenue than at any time since 2007. I think was the last high point. So we have dollars to pay our debts. This ensures, regardless of the cash flow, that our investors know that they will be paid on time with interest. Correct?
Yes, sir.
Final point: is this legislation investor neutral? So, in effect, if you're an American family that's invested in treasuries, the Federal Reserve that's buying them, or a foreign investor, it treats them all equally, and as the debt comes due, it just simply ensures that we're paying them all fully and on time so we avoid any of the other economic consequences.
Yes, sir, that's correct.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think taking default off the table, focusing Congress and the White House back on our spending problems and what we need to do to save Social Security and Medicare for every generation. I think this is exactly the financially responsible. I think a bipartisan bill we should be able to work around. Yield back.
All right, Mr. McDermott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask unanimous consent that a article written by Mr. Paul Krugman called The Excel Depression on 18 April this year be entered into the record.
Without objection.
Mr. Chairman, as I listen to these arguments and look around this room, I think I'm in the theater of the absurd. That's all I can think about is how much time we've spent in this room and others in this building listening to budget histrionics. Every program that helps people has to be cut, and every investment is too expensive because nothing is sacred when we worship at the altar of the deficit crisis. And now the basis of the hysteria, the one study that the debt hawks have been peddling as proof of our impending economic doom, has been entirely discredited by a doctoral student. In addition to some strange methods and selective data, the Reinhardt and Rogoff's findings from Harvard, of all places, that debt can slow growth were missing something very important. Rows 45 through 49 on their Excel spreadsheet were left out. In other words, the entire austerity debate has been based on one huge coding error. Read Mr. Krugman's article. And now we have another comedy of errors on the Ways and Means Committee. We're all debating not if, but how the United States ought to default on some of its debts. We're going to save Wall Street. We don't want Wall Street to be upset, but the rest of the country, we'll see what happens to them because they're not in this bill. Now, in August of 2011, it shouldn't be any hard for anybody on this committee to remember that. 2 years ago, Republicans brought us within days of default. It caused the worst period of job growth in years. It was a disaster, and America got nothing out of it but a downgraded credit rating. And now we're talking about doing it again? We're seriously being asked to consider legislation that would say it's okay to pay private bond holders, but kids in Head Start, seniors on Medicare, a generation of new vets coming home from war with injuries or who have been promised education, we can break our financial commitments to those people. Here's an idea. Why don't we pay all our bills? I mean, isn't that what an American family does? Aren't we being told we have to balance our books like an American family? Do Americans get to sit at home, rack up their debt, and then decide not to pay it? No one I know would default if they had a choice, and we do have a choice. In this committee, we have a choice. No one, no respected professional working in economics or in the financial market thinks that the default of any kind is good for the economy. The mainstream prediction is that any kind of default will cause a 1/3 drop in our GDP. Interest rates will skyrocket. Our international reputation as a reserve currency will be irreparably damaged. Europeans keep asking me when I meet them, what are you doing over there? How can you expect us to rely on the dollar? The American people have made it clear what they want us to do. We could be talking about immigration or guns, or better yet, job creation. Americans want an end to this economic slog, and economists agree. The only crisis we have is a job crisis. If we had more jobs, more people working, paying taxes, there would be less debt. Everybody knows, it's a very simple, you don't have to take calculus or differential equations to understand that. That's simple math. And where are the endless hearings about how to fix the job problem? Instead, the Republicans are going to drive us to the edge of the cliff again. More standoffs, more brinksmanship, and another chaotic August. Get ready, folks. This is going to test America's good credit again. We have the lowest tax revenue in 60 years, but they tell us they want to cut us more. We have the most extreme income inequality in our histories. but they tell us we should get rid of the safety net. They tell us we can't afford to invest in our current or future economy, and they will hold our credit hostage to get that way. All in the name of a phony budget crisis from a flawed study from Harvard. Now, I'm not interested in marking up this bill. I'm going to go down to the Ways and Means Committee where we're going to have a hearing on the whole question of transportation, where we have serious lacks of investment. I'm interested in throwing this bill away. America should pay all its bills.
All right, Mr. Ryan's recognized.
Thank you. And I'm glad the gentleman's going to spend some time at the Budget Committee today as well. I think that's what he meant. Mr. Payne, is the purpose of this bill to make sure that the United States government does not default on its bond regardless of the debt limit?
Yes, sir.
So what is default? Default is paying a bondholder, whoever that may be, person in a pension fund, senior citizen, a central bank, the principal plus interest at maturity. That's it. Cutting spending is not defaulting. Not redeeming a bond is defaulting. And we hear this inconsistent rhetoric from our friends on the other side of the aisle that says that we almost went to the brink, it hurt the economy, all this saber-rattling, all this brinksmanship hurts the economy. It's bad for growth. It's bad for jobs. Then why don't you support this? Because what this does is it removes that uncertainty. The whole purpose of this bill is to take default off the table, to prevent, to say, just without a shred of doubt, the United States government, regardless of the debt limit, is going to make good on its bonds, that we will not default on our bonds. So all the brinksmanship that everybody's worried about, all the blame that's been cast on past stock market gyrations is not going to be affected by the debt limit. Now, the second point is, it's as if you just want a blank check to keep going like we are. We've run up 4 annual trillion-dollar deficits. We see where Europe is going. They're in a debt crisis. Their governments made promises to their people that they can't keep. And so what are they doing? They're slashing the safety net. They're cutting retirement benefits. They're raising taxes. They're going back into recession. The youth unemployment rate in Greece and Spain is 50%. It's on average 20% in Europe. We don't want to copy those policies. That means we have to get our debt and deficits under control. And so when we see the administration give us a budget that has net spending increases, that doesn't propose to start reducing the deficit until 2020, 4 years after the president leaves office, when we see the Senate producing a budget that has net spending increases, no wonder you don't want to deal with this. No wonder you just want a blank check to keep raising borrowing. Problem is, no, I will not yield. The problem is, if we keep racking up this debt at the pace we are on, we will have that kind of European-style debt crisis. This debt and the overhang of this debt is hurting our economy. It's producing uncertainty. Uncertainty in the economy with businesses, uncertainty as to future bond prices and inflation rates. It's hurting job creation. So the sooner we can get a budget agreement to get the borrowing under control, the better off we're going to be. And while we do that, so that all the saber-rattling, all the hysterical rhetoric, we can put it aside and say we're not going to default. Nobody's talking about brinksmanship on default. What we're talking about is fixing our fiscal mess. This should be bipartisan. It's either you want this to fail so that you can keep the saber-rattling and keep the rhetoric and the talking points, which by your own acknowledgement is detrimental to the economy. So I don't understand that. Why not support this so that we can all unequivocally say, we're not going to default on our bonds. America's going to pay its bonds. End of story. And then let's go debate about how to fix our fiscal problem. I yield.
Mr. Neal is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Those arguments would have had a lot more credibility had they been offered during the Bush years as well. Now, Mr. McDermott and Mr. Brady both referenced the American family. I'm going to come to that in a second, but I do want to applaud the position Mr. McDermott offered on the challenge to austerity that was embraced by many members on the other side based on the Reinhart-Rogoff study. By the way, that was taken apart by 2 professors at the University of Massachusetts. successfully so, where I've had the good fortune of being a lecturer for many, many years, and that argument has now been put aside. But Mr. Payne, I want to ask you, based upon the American family issue here, do you have a credit card?
Again, I think
Oh, Mr.
questions
Chairman,
of a
this is
personal
entirely
nature-
relevant to the topic at hand.
And I don't see how that relates to
When I lay this out,
technical-
perhaps, Mr. Chairman, I think you will be very pleased with where I'm going.
Why don't you pursue the line of
Mr.
questioning
Chairman, do you
without
have a credit
his
card?
personal information?
Mr. Chairman, do you have a
we're-
credit card?
We're not going to get into the personal financial habits of members of the committee or the
Two
witness.
members of the committee have referenced the American
Why don't
family.
you talk about your own credit card then?
Well, I will. Why don't
Okay.
I
Use
take
that as
that
an
up?
example.
When you receive your statement on your credit card, and if you need a reference, Mr. Payne, as to whether or not you can get a credit card, feel free to give me a shout, since the chairman prevents you from answering that question. But when you get that credit card statement every month, if, for example, on that statement, it says that you needed to use the card for car repairs, said that you charged some clothing at LL Bean, perhaps that you took a vacation on Cape Cod. Might I ask you this? Do you have the luxury of saying that this month you're not going to pay the credit card because of you can't make the payment on LL Bean or on the vacation that you took? Mr. Chairman, this is
again,
entirely relevant. Mr. Brady
seems like
has
a
made reference
rhetorical
to the
question
American
to me, but-
family. I'm trying to highlight the idea that the American family is entirely relevant to this, and if you have a credit card statement where you use the three examples that I've just outlined, you do not have the luxury at the end of the month when that statement comes due of saying you're not going to pay part of it, even though you've extended your credit,
Well,
to
if you
take
don't
advantage
pay,
of it.
pay
And the
interest.
danger here is that your credit personally is downgraded if you don't make that full payment that you've agreed to at a time certain, based upon Mr. Ryan's assertion that those who hold the credit card expect that payment on a time and date certain. That's what this discussion is about here. Now, there are those here who rolled up this debt for years and only believe that these arguments are relevant when Clinton's president or Obama's president. And that's the basis of this argument today. This is the credit card argument that Mr. Brady and Mr. McDermott both referenced. The American family doesn't get to live like that, nor should we. That bill comes due, it ought to be paid. If you voted for the war in Iraq, if you voted for the war in Afghanistan, if you voted for the Bush tax cuts in 2001 and 2003 and the prescription drug benefit, it is beyond me, now that those bills have come due, why we make this argument here, which is really a facade to disguise the payments that should have been made in a timely manner and should continue to be made in a timely manner based upon a manufactured crisis.
All right, Mr. T. Berry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I would contend that we should support this when Dave Camp's president. I think your point's well taken, Mr. Neal. And I think this would have been great legislation to have 10 years ago. We didn't do it, but we should do it today. And when you're talking about credit cards, I'm thinking about my dad. My 79-year-old dad, who came to this country when he was 15 years old, didn't get a credit card till he was in his 60s. And my sisters and I convinced him to get a credit card because he could actually get money back. And so he's the only guy in America, Mr. Neal, who thinks he's screwing the credit card companies. You think about that, with a fifth grade education. With this, I believe, just kind of following up on the gentleman from Wisconsin's point, I believe this should be bipartisan. I think back to when the credit rating was downgraded. I think it was August of 2011, Mr. Payne, and we had a showdown here over our budget, over our debt. You were here. You're an economist. You believe that that downgrade had something to do with that showdown of the budget? And that's what we're trying to avoid in this? We haven't had a conversation. I'm just trying to tie this together.
Mr. T. Berry, as the chairman noted in his opening statement, Standard & Poor's listed in the note in which it announced the downgrade of the credit rating, the rationale for doing so, and it was because S&P felt that the Budget Control Act did not sufficiently address the long-term drivers of debt and deficits in the United States.
So what we're trying to do today is ease some of those fears. I guess I'm confused. I think there's plenty of blame to go around in terms of what got us here today, and I think there's plenty of bipartisan blame to go around. If my mom and dad are depending on Social Security, and back then when we were going through this debate, there was questions as to whether or not, because they asked me, is this going to impact my Social Security check? If this became law, what would I tell them?
Mr. Tiber, under this legislation, Treasury would have all the authority it would need to access the Social Security trust funds and ensure the full payment of Social Security benefits.
So with this legislation, we would give our constituents some hope. We would give the people that we owe money to some hope that we don't default. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to yield back. I'm kind of confused and stunned that this has to be difficult. I yield back.
All right, Mr. Doggett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Payne, if I understand this legislation correctly, it exempts from or accepts from the statutory debt limit only two types of obligations: payments on the public debt and payments for Social Security. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And you agree with Mr. Ryan that that is necessary to remove any uncertainty that those two types of payments will be made?
The chairman and the members of the committee have made that determination, sir.
You don't disagree with it?
I would never disagree with a member of Congress, sir.
You do not accept or exempt veterans' benefits, do you, in this bill?
Veteran benefits are not defined.
Are not exempt.
within-
So we don't remove the uncertainty to a disabled veteran.
Will the gentleman
They
yield?
will get their payment. No, I will not at this point. And do you exempt military pay?
Military pay is not within the definition.
So military, those who are serving our country around the world, uncertainty is not removed from them, that they will get their payments. Do you exempt Pell Grants and student financial assistance?
That is not within the definition.
So a student next fall, a Chinese bondholder will get certainty that they'll be paid, but there's no certainty that a student relying on financial assistance will be paid. How about air traffic controllers and the Federal Aviation Administration? Is it exempt under this bill?
Mr. Doggett, the legislation only exempts
So they're
those
not
things related to
exempt,
the issuance of
and the
public debt.
problems that we have right now with air traffic control, if this bill were in effect, could be expected to continue. What about road construction and the need to address our infrastructure? Is the Federal Highway Administration exempt under this bill?
Mr. Doggett, the legislation only covers principal and interest on the debt. So
Am I
it only
correct?
covers issues related
Am I
to the
correct,
issuance
Mr.
of debt.
Payne, that this bill, H.R. 807, as introduced, had as its stated purpose, quote, to require that the government prioritize all obligations on the debt held by the public in the event that the debt limit is reached? It's there in your folder.
I'm sorry, sir?
Do you agree that this bill, as introduced, H.R. 807, had as its stated purpose, it's there in your folder, to require the government prioritize all obligations on debt held by the public in the event the debt limit is reached?
Sir, I'm happy to comment on the amendment in nature to substitute submitted by the chairman.
That's the bill as introduced. I understand you don't want to answer any questions today, but you've got it there in your folder. Every member has it in their folder, and there's nothing in the nature of the substitute that changes that purpose. You placed a priority over paying Chinese bondholders, Saudi bondholders, Wall Street bondholders, over veterans, over military pay, over Pell Grants, over highway construction, over aircraft controllers. The party that prided itself, the Republican Party, in fiscal responsibility has become the party of fiscal folly. That's what's involved here today. It cost us almost $1.5 billion the last time you folks took us to the brink, almost $19 billion over a 10-year period, according to the Bipartisan Policy Center. And it's just absolutely incredible that we would be looking toward this year with all the uncertainties and with our economic recovery still in the recovery stage, that we would be looking once again at, for the first time in this nation's history, breaching our full faith and credit and leaving certainty for some bondholders, but leaving uncertainty for those who defend our country, who have defended our country, and on whom we depend for our economic expansion. This bill just assures us a difficult year in which the threat of default is used to accomplish partisan political objectives, and I yield back.
All right. Dr. Bustani.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Nobody on this side wants a default, and the bottom line on all of this is the fact that we do have past bills that are coming due and insufficient revenues to meet those past bills. We have to have a discussion about what reforms to make. Any small business owner knows that when your revenues do not match your outgo, and you're already maxed on your credit card and you've run through your credit limit, you have to have a discussion on how you're going to restructure this. Now, Secretary Geithner back in 2011 was prepared to unilaterally prioritize, but he never explained what that actually meant. And it wasn't clear, indeed, whether he had the authority to do anything like that. So, Mr. Payne, under this legislation, who would determine which obligations to pay other than principal and interest on our debt and interest due on Social Security trust funds?
Mr. Bustani, the legislation does not direct the Treasury to prioritize, so that responsibility would remain with Treasury.
So and does Treasury have the ability to deal with that? I mean, do they have the authority at this time?
There is some confusion among different policy experts, Mr. Bustani, so the legislation clarifies that irrespective of that, Treasury has the authority to pay principal and interest.
Right. And I think the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Ryan, made it very, very clear and pointed out the consequences of not paying on the public debt, regardless of who those bondholders are. And so I think it's pretty clear that we need to lend clarity to this debate, even though our friends on the other side of the aisle don't want to even entertain a discussion on how we can reduce spending, how we can deal with seniors who are depending on the Medicare program in the long run, but yet don't want to even discuss the problem or potential solutions for this. So I think we have to get our heads out of the sand, understand with clarity what authorities are needed going forward, and face the real problem that's in front of us. It's out of control spending. And with that, I'll yield back.
Mr. Becerra is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Payne, let me make sure we understand this. As far as I can tell, we've never tried to prioritize our debt through legislation so that we could feel comfortable defaulting on payments for previous obligations this country has undertaken, so that, well, then we can pay those things that we put at the top of the priority list. And from my understanding of this legislation, one of the priorities you place, or this legislation places on repayment of the debt, is on paying current bondholders, people who have lent the United States government money so that we could arm our troops or provide services to our seniors or to our children. But if you're not on that priority list, or if there's not enough money to go around, then for the first time, this Congress would like to tell the American people that it would be okay to not pay some of those debts. Now, it's unclear where we would end up if this legislation were to become law, and God forbid it should. But if it should, there is a strong likelihood that veterans in this country might be too far down the priority list to ever have some of the services that they earn through their service to our country, that they be met. And so my question to you is there anything in the legislation that would prevent a veteran in our country from losing services that the government has essentially committed to that veteran should this bill become law?
Mr. Becerra, assuming this bill became law and assuming we were still up against the statutory debt limit, the determination as to what other payments to make or not make would reside with the administration.
Right. So if the administration comes to us and says, because Congress, you passed this law, you've told us to prioritize the debt, we must pay China, which has lent us money, Japan, which has lent us money, U.S. banks, which have lent the taxpayers money to perform all sorts of services. But because we don't have enough money to pay all those past obligations today, and we must prioritize, if our obligation is to pay those priority debts first, obligations first, we're going to have to make cuts to services to our veterans, to our seniors, providing cancer research. There will be a time when someone falls below that line where we can provide services. So is there anything in the legislation that guarantees a veteran will not be see his or her services cut as a result of this legislation?
Mr. Becerra, it is conceivable that the administration would choose not to pay veterans benefits.
Okay, so there's no guarantee from what I hear you telling me, and that was my assessment of the legislation as well as I read through it. There's no guarantee here that based on this legislation that places a priority to paying bondholders or China or others before we provide services to our people, that a veteran will not find himself or herself at the short end on the short end of the stick in this regard when it comes to covering our obligations as a nation. Given that we have no guarantee in the legislation that a veteran will continue to receive his or her services, is there anything in the legislation that would guarantee our seniors would receive some of the services that they have been receiving for some time, through example, the Meals on Wheels program, or the home services for those who are unable to travel to receive lunch, or the subsidized housing programs for our seniors who are low income? Is there any guarantee in this legislation that would prevent them from having their services denied?
Mr. Becerra, under the hypothesis that this bill became law and that we were still operating up against the debt limit, it is conceivable the administration could choose not to fund those programs.
Okay, so based on this, right now the administration is saying it doesn't want this legislation because it's not the way to move forward, that putting a priority to paying China and other countries before our veterans and our seniors is not the way to move forward. And so this legislation would shackle the administration in making it make those tough choices, which ultimately could hurt our veterans, could hurt our seniors, could hurt our children. And I think that's why you see such opposition by the administration to this legislation. With that, Mr. Chairman, I see my time has expired. I'll yield back. And I thank Mr. Payne for his responses.
Thank you. Mr. Price, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm a little confused by the kind of conversation that's going on here, but I thought we probably ought to look at the bill. This is the piece of legislation we're talking about, the substitute piece of legislation that we're talking about, Section 2, which is the after the title. Mr. Payne says, in the event that the debt reaches the statutory limit, the Secretary of the Treasury shall pay the principal and interest on obligations of the United States as defined below. Isn't that right?
Yes, sir.
And then below it says that the Secretary of the Treasury shall pay obligations held by the public. What does that mean?
Public debt outstanding, sir.
And obligations held by the Old Age and Survivors Insurance Trust Fund and Disability Insurance Trust Fund. What does that mean?
Those are references to the Social Security Trust Fund, sir.
So this doesn't have anything in here about prioritization. This doesn't have anything in here about a priority list or what ought to be paid or what ought not be paid.
No, sir.
So when our friends say that veterans might not be paid, Head Start might not be paid, military might not be paid, Pell Grants might not be paid, highway construction might not be paid, seniors might not be paid, cancer research, on and on and on, those decisions are with the administration, correct?
Yes, sir.
So then I got to sit back and I got to think, well, now why would our friends on the other side of the aisle have concerns about what the administration might do with the resources over and above the obligations that we're defining here so that the country doesn't default? And it's a little interesting to kind of evaluate that question, and it may have something to do with the fact that the administration right now is playing huge politics with the sequester, deciding where to cut resources that affect the American people. And the only way I can answer why do the Democrats on this committee have concern about their president, the president of their party, about what he's going to pay, and it's got to be because they don't trust him not to hurt people based upon what he's going to pay. So it's confusing to me. Our friends talk about the job situation and how we got to the brink as a nation a couple years ago. You know, there's some things that kind of led up to that. One was a stimulus bill, $800 billion that didn't work, then harmed the economy and decreased jobs in this country. The other was the ACA, the health care bill, that folks in my district are just shuddering with what's going on with this bill and the rules and the regulations, and saying how they're not going to be able to hire any more people. They're moving full-time people to part-time people, and then there's the Dodd-Frank legislation that was passed that results in all sorts of regulatory oppression to banks and other entities out there to decrease job creation. So yeah, the people are concerned about jobs. There's no doubt about it. And it's because of this administration that they're concerned about jobs, because they know that with the uncertainty and the rules that are being put in place, it's becoming much more difficult. And then the wonderful credit card example. Now, when if you've got too much debt on your credit card, what happens? Credit card company says you can't charge anymore. You still got to pay for what you put on the credit card.
Would the gentleman yield?
Which is no, not this time. Thanks. Which is exactly what this bill does. Make certain that we pay that minimum balance, and utilizes any extra resources coming into the federal government to pay down the debt and to pay on the other programs, the other obligations. So what we are saying on our side of the aisle is you ought not take on more debt. And until we come to an agreement as a Congress, which is absolutely vital and must be done in a bipartisan way, to decide how we're going to move forward and solve these incredible economic challenges and financial challenges that we have, then this piece of legislation just makes a whole lot of sense. So I want to commend the chairman and the staff on the committee for the work that they've done to focus on where the focus needs to be, and that is making certain that we pay our obligations, and that we make certain that we pay under the Social Security obligations, and that we hopefully provide the impetus to be able to work together to solve the challenges that we've got. I yield back.
Thank you, Doctor. Mr. Kine, do you care to question?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I would, and thank you so much for the hearing and that. But, Mr. Chairman, I'm sitting here kind of perplexed trying to understand the reasoning and the arguments on the other side of why this legislation is necessary to begin with. And the way I see it is the only reason you're bringing this bill forward is with the intention to default on certain obligations that we've incurred as a nation for the first time in our nation's history. I mean, that seems to be the basis of this bill. And it's very troubling because there is a great X factor out there that we're playing with, and it's playing with fire. Because no one can tell us today with any degree of certainty what the market reaction will be if we decide to default on some of our obligations but not all of our obligations. And the truth is, I would suspect that in the marketplace, if they see the United States government willing to say, you know, we've incurred these financial obligations, but we're just choosing not to pay it, the thought that's going to run through investors' minds, whether domestic or foreign, will be, who's next? If we're willing to even think about defaulting on some of our financial obligations that have already been incurred, everyone's going to be asking, how crazy can this Congress be the next time around? And who else is going to be on the short end of not getting paid with the obligations that we face? And no one, I suspect, on the panel here today, or you, Mr. Payne, can predict with any certainty what the economic consequences or the market reaction will be if we decide to just default on some of our obligations. And in my book, a default is a default is a default. And jeopardizing the full faith and credit of the United States of America for the very first time is playing with economic fire. And Mr. Payne, I don't know, and the question I have for you, I don't know if you were here when the MIT economist Simon Johnson was here testifying before the committee, because we had asked him specifically about this issue, of whether a partial default or choosing what obligations to pay and what not to pay, what the consequences would be. And he said that it potentially could lead to a doubling of the unemployment rate, given the adverse economic consequences of a partial default, not even a complete default. Have you had a chance to either talk to Mr. Johnson or look at his analysis and to see whether or not what he was saying might even remotely be true, Mr. Payne?
No, sir, I have not talked to him about his analysis.
Well, I don't think he's alone in this analysis either. There are many economists throughout the country today who say that one of the worst things we can do as far as the economic recovery and the job growth that we need right now is to play with this fire and to play this game again. We saw what the consequences of this was a year and a half ago with the downgrade on our rating and the great market uncertainty that was created and the chill effect it had on job creation. It was like running into a brick wall. And apparently we learned nothing from that episode from a year and a half ago. And this, what is most mind-boggling about this is all self-inflicted. This is an unforced economic error that we're about to commit by claiming that we can somehow thread the needle in what type of obligations we choose to honor and respect and what ones we're not going to. This has never been done before in our nation's history. And the one thing that sustained us during this very tough economic time and the great recession that we're coming out of right now has been the full confidence and the full faith and credit of the United States of America. There's been a flight to safety that we have been a direct beneficiary from these recent years, only because the rest of the world is convinced that we will not default on our financial obligations. And yet we're introducing that degree of uncertainty right now in the marketplace and in investor minds. And no one can say with any certainty just what that reaction will be. But I will guarantee you that any reasonable investor, if they see this happening, will immediately start wondering, who's next? Am I going to be next? Who else are they willing to default on in order to use this as political leverage? The answer of this is let's go to conference on the budget. We've had budget resolutions passed in both the House and the Senate, and there's dragging of the feet right now over here on the House side about going to conference and working out a budget agreement. And ideally, we'd have a comprehensive long-term deficit reduction agreement that we can finally come to terms with. That would be the answer to all of this, and that's what we should be focused on. And that would bring, I think, greater confidence and certainty in the marketplace if we can get our act together. But this is economic fire, and it's going to blow up in our face if there's even a partial default. And I hope we don't end up in a game of chicken, because the President's been very clear from the outset that he's not going to play this game. He's not going to allow the debt ceiling to be used as leverage for other political gain. And I hope we don't come to that point. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Buchanan. You carried a question?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Payne, you had introduced as a part of the materials today this debt subject to statutory limits. Do you have the copy of that in front of you? If you look at it in the last 50 years, this isn't a Democrat or Republican problem, it's both. In 50 years, we've balanced the budget 5 times. If you look at it in the last 30 years, we've gone from $1 trillion in debt to almost $17 trillion. If you look at it since 2000, we've gone from $5.5 trillion to $16 trillion. That's why we need to move towards a constitutional balanced budget amendment at some point. I know my colleagues talk about programs. We're putting everything at risk. It's unfortunate that we have this discussion today about this legislation, but we're heading down the road where we're going to put clearly everything at risk and the country at risk when you take a look at this, what we're doing with the spending, the deficits, and the debts. If you were a business with a lot less zeros, you'd be in workout with the banks right now, with any bank, if you ran up this kind of deficits and debt. So again, I just think that when I do town halls, whether it's last night on the phone or last Saturday, everybody but Washington gets it, that we've got to curb spending, we've got to bend the curve on spending and move more towards a balanced budget amendment so we don't have to have these kind of discussions. But we need this kind of discussion because at some point in 2, 5, or 8 years, this is all going to end badly.
And as Democrats and Republicans, for the sake of the country, we need to work towards cutting spending and moving back to a constitutional balanced budget amendment over a period of time, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thompson, you carried a question?
Yes, I do.
You're recognized.
And I don't know, Mr. Chairman, if there's somebody here that can respond to it, but my concern, one of my concerns with this is, if this were to pass, it seems to me that it would send a pretty loud message to the world and to the markets that we are, in fact, going to default. What happens? How do they respond? Has anybody looked at that? Do we have any analysis on that?
Would gentlemen care to yield? I'd be happy to
Of course.
respond. The entire purpose of this bill is to prevent default.
How does it do that?
This rhetoric I hear is weird. It's actually as if you're making a case for this bill. Remember, default is not cutting spending. Default is paying your bonds when they come due, plus interest.
Reclaiming
and
my
this
time.
requires that is done under any scenario.
My time. If the and I guess it's appropriate that the chair of the budget committee respond to this, but can you tell me how, in fact, it does that? And have you heard from anybody in the market as to what sending this message would mean?
Are you addressing your question to the witness?
No.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought
Chairman of the Budget
this.
Committee.
What this means is we won't default. Pass this bill, and the message to the credit markets, the message to the bondholders, the message to the pension funds, the message to the world is America's not going to default. It's the safe and secure bond, regardless of the political hysterics in Washington.
Reclaiming my
default
time,
will not happen.
it sounds to me that it's just the opposite. That we're saying, hey, we're gonna crash.
It's quite
and
the
when we
contrary. Read the
do,
legislation. It says we
wanna
will
set
not
up
default.
This means by which to pay our creditors, and you know that's if you use the personal analogy, that's kind of what you do when you go into a Chapter 13.
You know, I think your concern is valid, and therefore I think you ought to support the bill once you review it, because this says we will not default.
But reclaiming my time, I would think that it would be valuable to get somebody here where I heard, and I apologize, I came in late because of an Intelligence Committee hearing, but as I came in, I heard someone from the majority side saying that everybody at home gets it except Washington. I'd like to hear from everybody else, or the people who do get it, some experts, some people who are doing this every day on the ground, and the people that have to deal with the actions of Congress or the inactions of Congress. And I think it would be good if this committee took the time to hear from some of those real-life experts who would have to live with the consequences of this measure passing. Yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Ms. Jenkins, do you care to question?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I'm just concerned that we've lost sight of why this bill is even necessary. As I listen to the other side, I too am convinced that they're for this bill, and the only reason we're even talking about it is because they are unwilling to present a plan on how to balance the budget. I've listened to Congressman Neal try to compare this to a family paying their credit card at the end of the month, and he used the example of charging clothes at LL Bean and taking a vacation to the North Shore. People in Kansas, when they don't have enough money to pay their bills, they don't shop at LL Bean, they're going to go to Walmart. And a vacation is a luxury that we all can't afford when times are tough. So the whole idea drives the point that what we have to do is stop spending more money than we take in every year. We hear about Mr. Bucera concerned about Meals on Wheels and vet payments. Again, this drives the point of why don't we balance our budget? Republicans have a budget that does that in 10 years, and the Democrat proposal never, ever, balances. So if we want to take default entirely off the table, how about y'all come up with a budget that balances? Let's pass a balanced budget amendment, and let's take care of this problem once and for all. This is the responsible thing to do, to take default off the table until we can work out how we're going to live within our means like the people in Kansas do. I yield back.
Okay. Mr. Crowley, you care to question?
I do, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Mr. Payne, I have a few simple yes or no answer questions, and fear not, they're straightforward questions. So, this bill, if enacted into law, it will prioritize federal payments first to bondholders. Is that correct?
No, Mr. Crowley, there's nothing in the legislation that prioritizes payments.
So it basically exempts them from the debt. Is that correct?
It allows Treasury to issue debt to pay principal and interest. Yes, sir.
And by bondholders, your bill specifies those holding the privately held debt of the U.S. government, of which 55% is held by foreign nationals like China and Japan. Is that correct?
All public debt is covered by legislation, sir.
And 55% is held by foreign nationals like China and Japan. Is that correct?
I don't have that stat in front of me, sir. I'm sorry.
Where in the bill are the benefits of veterans protected? Because in this bill, I don't see the word veteran once in this three-page bill. So are veterans' benefits protected in this debt limit prioritization plan that you have here today?
Mr. Crowley, as we discussed with Mr. Becerra,
Yes or no, are they protected in this bill?
that is up to the administration, sir.
It's not yes or no. Is there language protecting Medicare payments and seniors in this bill? Do they get top billing over foreign banks? Yes or no?
I'm sorry, Mr. Crowley, but there's nothing in the legislation that requires prioritization at all.
How about protecting the payments to our active duty military personnel? Does this bill provide any special prioritization treatment to our troops as it does for foreign banks and foreign nationals?
I'm sorry, Mr. Crowley, there's nothing on prioritization in the bill at all.
Will enactment of this bill into law create new debt? Yes or no?
Yes, sir.
Will create new debt. So this bill will do nothing to lower our debt, but will ensure foreign nationals and foreign banks like those in Switzerland and China are paid, but our active duty military or veterans or our seniors on Medicare will not be paid. Is that correct?
Mr. Crowley, there's nothing in the bill that requires prioritization of payments.
So clearly then, I think you haven't read the bill. That will explicitly states on page 1, and I quote, "The Secretary of the Treasury shall, in addition to any other authority provided by law, issue obligations under Chapter 31 of Title 31, United States Code, to pay with legal tender the principal and interest on obligations of the United States." So this bill should be called the Pay China First Act or Put America Last Act, as that's what this bill will do. This extreme, perverse bill has gone to a new level to take Americans' hard-earned tax dollars and send them overseas to help bankers in Shanghai, Zurich, and Tokyo, but not to pay our veterans' benefits, not to pay our troops overseas. I think that's deplorable, and I will yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Reed, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would respectfully disagree with my good friend from New York on his reference to the impacts of this bill. But rather than to go down that path, as a businessman, a small businessman who started 4 businesses, I always like to hope for the best, prepare for the worst, and I think this legislation takes us down that path of making sure that if we have to deal with this situation, we put ourselves in the best position possible in that scenario. But one of the things I'm concerned about, Mr. Payne, is by delegating this authority to the Treasury Department of Treasury, how do we make sure as members here that there's an oversight component, an accountability component to that authority or discretion that is handed to the Treasury Department? What does the bill do in regards to that?
Mr. Reed, the legislation contains 2 key provisions with respect to your question. The first is that this authority is only available when Treasury is up against the statutory debt limit. And it also requires weekly reports from Treasury to the Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee on how it utilizes this authority when it has that authority to utilize.
Okay. So that information would be freely subject to our review and ability to access it?
Yes, sir.
And do you anticipate what areas of abuse potentially are there that we should be on notice of? Does the bill address any of those concerns, or is it something of a general nature?
Mr. Reed, the legislation is further constrained by requiring Treasury to limit this authority only to the payment of principal and interest as defined, and it can't be used to issue debt to pay for other obligations, general spending and such.
Well, with that, I will yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Mr. Davis, you care to inquire?
Yes, sir. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Payne, if this legislation is passed, does it mean that we are more likely or less likely to pay all of our bills?
Did you say none of these guys want a question?
Mr. Davis, the legislation is completely agnostic to that question.
Well, then, while Treasury may be forced to default on salaries for troops, default on veterans' benefits, default on payments to doctors and hospitals who treat Medicare patients, default on payments to American small businesses who supplied goods and services to the federal government and expected to be paid, the Treasury would be allowed to continue paying private bondholders, and over 40% of that debt is held by foreign nationals, and China is the largest foreign holder of our debt. So this bill is only necessary if we're planning to become a deadbeat nation, one that doesn't pay all the bills it has already incurred. And after we default and unemployment skyrockets, this bill would add insult to injury by paying China before our troops and veterans, our doctors and hospitals, and our small businesses before providing food to hungry American children or improving our schools. Is this scenario possible on the passage of this bill?
Mr. Davis, under the assumption that this bill is enacted into law and that Treasury is up against the statutory debt limit, the question about what bills to pay would reside with the administration.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Paulson, do you care to inquire?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, if I could, real quick. So, Mr. Payne, just so I'm following this, and I've looked at the bill and read it, it's not very long. So, if we pass this legislation, this guarantees that our debt will be repaid. We won't miss any payments on our debt.
Yes, sir.
Well, and Mr. Payne and members, I guess I'm just following this. It seems to me to make sense that this guarantees that not only foreign bondholders that hold our debt are going to be paid off, because those are obligations that we have to pay and we don't want to default. But, Mr. Payne, is it also true that there are pension funds, families, and others that hold bonds that would be paid if we pass this legislation and guaranteed they would be paid?
Mr. Paulson, there is wide variation of debt holders, including pension funds, who would be paid.
Well, Mr. Chairman, it just seems to me that the legislation that was offered by the chair of the committee under the nature of a substitute is the right direction to go in the context of what some of my colleagues have already characterized as a challenge with our spending practices, et cetera. But this leaves the administration the ability to continue to pay, obviously, all the bills that are going to be there. But the primary focus of this bill is not to miss any debt payments, to not default. And it's just prudent that we move forward, and it's a pretty simple measure. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
All right. I believe Ms. Black? I'm sorry, Mr. Marchant. I skipped you. I apologize. Okay, you're done. You're not seeking recognition. All right. Is there anyone else seeking recognition? Okay, Ms. Black.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just really quickly, because I want to be sure that I understand this correctly, by taking default off of the table, do we send a message to the people as well as our markets that the U.S. will not fail to meet our debt obligations while ensuring that our seniors and those with disabilities are also protected?
Ms. Black, this legislation would unquestionably guarantee that the United States Treasury would not miss a debt payment or Social Security payment.
And so therefore, we give assurances not only to those that we owe money, our debt, but also to those who are getting those services that are so important, such as our parents that are waiting for their Social Security checks or those with disabilities. And I think that is so important because we keep hearing the other side talk about how this rocks the markets, how it creates uncertainty with people, that there's just this clear statement that by having this amendment, it is going to give assurances to both of those very important sectors of our economy. Thank you very much. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. I believe Mr. Kelly has asked for recognition.
And I thank the chairman. Mr. Payne, thank you for being here. Now, it was described earlier about this is the theater of the absurd. I could not agree more. This piece is called the Full Faith and Credit Act, which is about protecting bondholders, right? It's not about when we prioritize. This isn't about not paying other bills that we have there. This is about making sure that we send a message to the world that we're going to make good on what we've asked or what we borrowed, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Well, I've got a solution. If we could just get these pesky Chinese to quit buying our debt, boy, would we be in a lot better shape. It is just amazing to me that we sit back and let these folks, why we let them buy our debt? It would be so simple if we just lived within our means. We could cut all these folks out, then we wouldn't have to worry about those payments. I keep hearing this has never been done before. Well, I don't think the country's ever been on the brink of a $17 trillion red figure before either. And this comparison to credit cards is a totally theater of the absurd, because you could never, in your private life, raise your debt limit any time you wanted to. You could never print your own money any time you wanted to. You could never continue reckless spending any time you wanted to and then go back to your lender and say, you know what, I need more. We are so addicted to spending that we are in denial in the path that we are taking. The trajectory of this debt is absolutely incredible. And when I read the credit ratings, it's not so much the amount of debt, it was the fact that the people that rate us said, you know what, I don't think they're ever going to get their spending under control. And if Europe is looking to us and hoping that somehow we'll be able to stabilize so they can keep investing in us, the only stable investment in the world right now, at least from what I see, if we don't do this, this is the worst thing we could do to hurt our rating. It would drive our interest rates crazy.
Will the gentleman yield?
No, I will not. We've been yielding far too much for far too long. Listen, Mr. Payne, thank you for coming forward today, and I want to thank the chairman for having this hearing. It just blows out into the public to see the straw men that we construct every day to take away from the real problem. We are not going to default, and that's what everybody in this room should be concerned about. This is a great piece of legislation that prevents that from happening. But we're not going to do that. We're going to talk about veterans. We're going to talk about children. We're going to talk about the older folks. We're going to talk about everything out there but the fact that we are in denial and continue to borrow money and lay it on our children and our children's children for years to come and say, you know, it's going to be okay. I've been in this town for a little bit over 2 years now. This merry-go-round had better stop sometime. You could never do in the private sector what we do here and then go out and try to defend it. Both parties, for too long, have spent way too much with too little responsibility. And if we don't do things like this, my goodness, where's this country going? So, again, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you. I'm going to yield back. Thank you.
I have two speakers, or two requests for time left, Mr. Pascrell and then Mr. Griffin. Mr. Pascrell.
I'd like to introduce into the record a statement dealing with the Standard & Poor's on prioritizing debt payments. Just the opening paragraph. Prioritizing debt payments to avoid a default would be, quote-unquote, deeply disruptive to the economy, Standard & Poor's global head of sovereign rating said in an interview. today. May I introduce this?
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, the debt limit itself has nothing to do with spending. We have an appropriations process. We have the venues to have vigorous debates about how much and how little, how government should spend and how much or how little we should collect in taxes. Having those debates are the only way we are able to actually come to an agreement on how to responsibly reduce our deficit. And Democrats welcome that debate. Let's talk about the sequester cuts now that they're history, and we hope that we can overturn them eventually. I'm happy to talk about the cuts in the budget that have been presented by the loyal opposition. That will reduce non-defense discretionary spending by 2.2% of GDP, the lowest level in modern history. Imagine how many flight delays that will result in. But it is just plain irresponsible to use the debt limit, the full faith and credit of the United States, as the vehicle to continue this ideological crusade against government in and of itself. We saw the downgrade by Standard & Poor's. The Government Accountability Office estimated that 2011 federal borrowing costs increased by $1.3 billion. I have a question, if I may ask Mr. Payne. Let me ask you this question. Under the bill, will our debt increase or decrease?
Mr. Pascrell, nothing in the legislation raises the statutory debt limit.
I'm sorry?
The bill does not raise the statutory debt limit.
So the debt increase would not result with this legislation?
There would be no increase in the statutory debt limit. There could be some increase in overall debt levels.
There would be. There would be some increases. Okay, very good. How do you borrow to pay this then? How would you increase the debt to pay our bills?
Mr. Pascrell, the legislation gives Treasury the authority to pay principal and interest on.
Okay, now would Treasury be able to, following what you just said, would Treasury be able to borrow to pay Social Security employees?
The legislation only provides that authority for principal and interest on the debt. So that's debt held by the public and debt held by the Social Security trust funds.
So, in other words, you can't guarantee to me, since we're going through the weeds of the legislation now, you can't guarantee to me that we can borrow money, the Treasury borrows the money, to pay the employees who work for Social Security. How about active duty military? How would we pay them?
It's up to the administration to determine what payments to make, sir.
Where would they get the money?
Tax receipts and other revenue.
But if you are, right now, you're saying to us that there is no indication here that you're prioritizing, that's not in the bill, the word is not even in the bill. So we should expect in passing of this legislation that we would continue to do what we're doing as we've done in a bipartisan fashion over the last 15 years, and that is pay our debts. Find a way to pay our debts. There's nothing in this legislation that forces cuts in the budget, correct? Well, look, it either does or it doesn't.
There is nothing in the legislation, Mr. Pascrell, that would change either appropriations or budget process.
So that would remain the same, even though you would have, certain obligations. If we're doing the same thing and just finding another way to do it, what are we accomplishing? What will be accomplished? That we send a message to the world that we're going to pay all of our debts? Well, they know that already. We have to. We're obligated. There's no way to get out of paying your debts, right? The government I'm talking about.
The purpose of the legislation, Mr. Pascrell, is to grant Treasury the authority and responsibility to pay principal and interest.
Mr. Chairman, can I just make one more sentence?
One quick sentence, and then we'll go to Mr.
It's a long sentence, but it will be one sentence.
Well, all right.
Mr. Chairman.
All right, very quickly.
I just wanted to put an end to the comparison on this committee on both sides of the aisle of comparing the national budget to our family budget. There is no similarity whatsoever. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Griffin is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Those are the type of sentences that William Faulkner was good at writing. The point of this legislation, it seems, is to avoid default. And I think some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have gotten their talking points confused, because some of them made the point that we shouldn't default on our obligations, and that's the whole point of this legislation, so we don't default. But then others on the other side of the aisle made the point that we're going to pay China, we're going to pay other debt holders, foreign debt holders, and the answer is we're going to pay our debts. But the service that these folks who have raised China have done is they have pointed out to the people watching that we have a problem in that we have to rely on China and other foreign countries to fund our spending habit. About almost 50% of our debt is held overseas. That's a problem. The point of this legislation is to make sure that we send the message to the world that we're going to pay our debts, that we're not going to default. Now, I know that the other side of the aisle would like to get into all the details of what the administration will pay, when they will pay it, but that's up to the administration. I would assume that they trust the President and the Treasury to prioritize on their own, figure out what they're going to pay, when they're going to pay it. The point of this is to say, whatever else we do, we will not default. We will pay our debts. And so I want to just ask you, Mr. Payne, first of all, thanks for enduring this today and for being with us. I've taken a look at the legislation, and a lot of what's been said about it is not grounded in the language of the legislation. And so if I'm talking to constituents today, after I leave here, and they got a glimpse of this, and they want to know in everyday language what this bill does, is it fair to say that the point of this bill is to make sure that we don't default on our obligations?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the remainder of my time.
Thank you. Ms. Schwartz is recognized.
Thank you very much, and I think the conversation that we've had already has certainly made clear a difference of opinion about whether, in fact, your answer that you just gave about whether this legislation helps us meet our obligations or, in fact, makes sure we don't meet our obligations. I mean, you just said it helps us meet our obligations. Actually, it only does in a very narrow way. I mean, an important one. We want to protect our seniors and Social Security as well, but it leaves out a whole lot. So I would say that was, are you sure you were correct in your last answer to the previous speaker, that in fact this protects us and makes sure that we don't default on any of our obligations or in fact risk the full faith and credit of the United States? You're sure about that?
Ms. Schwartz, Mr. Griffin's question was specific to public debt, and the answer to that is yes.
Then make sure we meet our obligation on our public debt, that we do not default on any of that debt.
Yes.
How can you say that?
Ms. Schwartz, the legislation both requires and grants Treasury the authority to pay all principal and interest.
Okay, but it does not enable us or ensure that we're going to actually pay the debts the United States has. It prioritizes it in a very narrow way, and the potential for default is a serious one. We've come through a very difficult recession. We're seeing some recovery. We know that last time the Republican leadership suggested that we default on our debt and the full faith and credit of the United States, we were downgrading the United States. We saw investors no longer investing. We saw a contraction in the economy. It hurt American businesses and American families. And that's clear evidence. In fact, I want to enter into a record a Wall Street Journal article that says that there are 2 different routes to downgrading the U.S. debt rating. That is going to make it harder and more expensive to borrow money and is going to hurt the United States economy. And that is what this legislation does. The fact that we're even having this discussion that we might default on our obligation as Americans to pay our debts is going to hurt the economy. We know that, and yet that is what the Republican majority is putting forward. So enter into the record this article, and I hope that this legislation, which is likely to pass this committee, does not pass the House and certainly does not pass the credit, and I hope it does not.
Will the gentleman yield?
Without objection, the article is entered into the record.
Sure.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Thank you. I do think that this discussion is woefully unhealthy for our economy. The fact of the matter is we will not default on our debt. I don't think anyone here on this panel believes we'll ever default on our debt. And I think the purpose of this hearing and discussions over the last few weeks has been unhealthy for our economy.
Thank you.
But in my request to ask Mr. Kelly to yield to me, which unfortunately was denied, he made reference to China owning a large portion of our debt, and what can we do about that? I think we all would ask that question, but in answer to a question that he had, Mr. Payne, he asked you, do bondholders go first? Do they get first priority? And you said to him, yes. We can check the record. When I asked the same question, you told me no. So which is correct? Do bondholders get priority if Mr. Kelly asks the question? And if I ask it, it's no. What's the correct answer?
Mr. Crowley, I don't recall that being Mr. Kelly's question.
We can check the record if you like.
I don't recall Mr. Kelly using the word prioritization.
What do you recall him saying,
if,
Mr. Payne?
if the specific question is, does the legislation prioritize certain bondholders, the answer to that question is no.
Okay.
Irrespective of who answers it.
Irrespective of what your answer was to Mr. Kelly.
I'm sorry, Mr. Kelly, I don't believe that it was his question.
He asked the same question I did.
Mr. Crowley, I'm sorry, I don't think
I
that
yield
was
back
the
to the
case.
gentlelady.
All
Let me
right.
just say, the point here is that I think you're one of the chief economists for the Republican majority here, and you're so uncertain about or can't really say whether, in fact, this is going to hurt the economy, or if it does, it's still the presentation that you're putting forward makes it sound very benign. It is not benign.
Well,
And
I would just say
economists,
to
it's hard
the
believe
gentlelady
that
that whether it hurts the economy or not is not a technical review of the legislation. And so that's asking for a conclusion that is beyond the scope of this witness to offer.
Interesting. Okay, well, I would hope, then I would just say that I would hope that as Republicans put this forward, that at least as elected members who represent many of our constituents who've been hurt by the downturn in the economy, that you take it into account, as most economists, if not every economist, has said this is going to be harmful to the economy, which doesn't mean that we aren't all concerned about the deficit and the debt. The issue here is not whether we're concerned about the debt and the deficit. It is whether we, in fact, are going to protect the full faith and credit of the United States, that we're not going to hurt the economic growth, and that we're actually going to begin to grow this economy. That's what this vote is about. And if Mr. Payne can answer these questions, I certainly hope that my colleagues on this committee will take very seriously concern, most economists in this country, and most American businesses and family have as well. And I yield.
I would just say for the record that 2 credit agencies have informed this committee that this legislation would not hurt the credit standing of the United States. I understand there are no further people seeking recognition. Are there, so there being no further questions? Oh, Mr. Levin.
So now we'll sum up.
Well, we're not really summing up. We are in question period, which you've already had a chance to do, and now we're moving into amendments. So why don't we go to amendments? Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Mr. Ryan.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment, a purely technical amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute. On page 2, strike line 8 and insert the following.
Will the gentleman suspend while the
Yes.
amendment is distributed?
We are all independent actors. We shouldn't be, but, you know, I mean, come on, look at
Yeah, got it.
right, the gentleman may continue. Gentleman may continue.
Yep, this is a purely technical amendment to make explicit what the section implies, which is to exempt the incremental costs of financing the debt in order to avoid default. It's just that simple. I just want to make sure that in the end of the sentence, it's very clear. That's it.
Mr. Payne, have you had a chance to look at the amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
And do you have any comment on the amendment?
No, sir.
All right. Anyone seeking recognition?
On the amendment?
The question then is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Ryan. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Are there any additional amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? All right, Mr. Levin.
Well, let me sum up what's really going on here. What the Republicans are doing is positioning themselves so that as we approach the debt ceiling, they're going to be able to say they think that the full faith and credit of this country is not jeopardized. I think this hearing has been filled with kind of 1984-ish type of rhetoric. Essentially, this kind of positioning, to be able to say they think that we're going to pay the bonds and pay Social Security so there is no jeopardy, is very dangerous positioning, to say the least. Essentially, this is prioritization. What it is prioritization by exclusion. That's what you're doing. In answer to Mr. Griffin's comments, he says, you say, sir, we should pay our bills. What essentially this legislation is saying, we will pay some debts, but not others. That's essentially what's being said here. And the notion is that this will not jeopardize our economy. Let me just read from a statement that was entered into the record by a spokesman for Standards & Poor's. He said in this statement, captured in a release of July 26, Treasury could, in quotes, theoretically prioritize debt payments over other government obligations for some time while negotiations continue in Washington. By the way, that's exactly what's being suggested here. And he then says, but it's worth remembering what that would mean. It would mean a very sudden fiscal shock that the longer it lasted would filter powerfully throughout the system. Potentially, that would be deeply disruptive to the economy. That's what this bill does. It plays with fire with the economy of this country in an effort to try to position the Republicans to have more leverage as we face the debt ceiling. That is reckless. It is reckless. It is irresponsible. It's playing with words. Pay some bills, but not others. And maybe what is worst of all, because I don't think this is going anywhere, except to give the Republicans theoretically more leverage, only theoretically, is that it's another kind of nail in the coffin in terms of efforts for bipartisanship. We are only going to solve our debt issues, our budget issues, by some kind of bipartisan effort. And essentially what this bill does, playing with fire to try to increase leverage, is to say to this Congress and to say to this country that continuing to play with the debt ceiling is something the Republican Party is willing to risk. It is a dangerous risk. You tried it a few years ago. You should not try it again. I yield back.
Well, I would say, before I recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of making a motion, I would just say that two major credit rating agencies, not the Republican Party, not the Democratic Party, have said that they would distinguish between failure to make a debt payment and any other payment obligation of the United States.
That doesn't
So
mean
according,
they would say.
gentlemen, I have the floor. Please, I listened to you very painfully, and you now need to listen to me. I would just say that the credit agencies have said that it is unlikely that failure to pay any other obligation other than public debt would prompt a review of the United States Credit Rating Agency. So that is what the purpose of this legislation is to make sure that Treasury has the authority, as we have done as this Congress did in 1996, makes sure that the public debt of the United States is paid and that we don't default. And I know that default is such a big concern that many members on the other side said simply uttering the word default is hurting the economy. Well, what we're trying to do is do more than just deliver rhetoric, but actually have a way for the Treasury of the United States, the Treasury Department, to be able to pay the public debt as well as interest so that Social Security payments can continue to be paid. So with that, I would recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.R. 807 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those opposed signify by saying no. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Johnson?
Aye.
Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Brady?
Aye.
Mr. Brady votes aye. Mr. Ryan?
Aye.
Mr. Ryan votes aye. Mr. Nunez? Mr. Nunez votes aye. Mr. Teaberry? Mr. Teaberry votes aye. Mr. Reichert? Mr. Reichert votes aye. Mr. Bustani? Mr. Bustani votes aye. Mr. Roscom? Mr. Roscom votes aye. Mr. Gerlach? Mr. Gerlach votes aye. Mr. Price? Mr. Price votes aye. Mr. Buchanan? Mr. Buchanan votes aye. Mr. Smith? Mr. Schock? Mr. Schock votes aye. Ms. Jenkins? Ms. Jenkins votes aye. Mr. Paulson? Mr. Paulson votes aye. Mr. Marchant? Mr. Marchant votes aye. Ms. Black? Ms. Black votes aye. Mr. Reed? Mr. Reed votes aye. Mr. Young? Mr. Young votes aye. Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly votes aye. Mr. Griffin? Mr. Griffin votes aye. Mr. Renacci? Mr. Renacci votes aye. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes no. Mr. Rangel? Mr. Rangel votes no. Mr. McDermott? Mr. McDermott votes no. Mr. Lewis? Mr. Lewis votes no. Mr. Neal? Mr. Becerra? Mr. Becerra votes no. Mr. Doggett? Mr. Doggett votes no. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes no. Mr. Larson? Mr. Larson votes no. Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Kine? Mr. Kine votes no. Mr. Pascrell? Mr. Crowley? Mr. Crowley votes no. Ms. Schwartz? Ms. Schwartz votes no. Mr. Davis? Mr. Davis votes no. Mr. Sanchez? Ms. Sanchez? Ms. Sanchez votes no. Mr. Smith? Mr. Neal? Mr. Blumenauer? Chairman Camp?
Aye. The clerk will report the vote.
22 ayes, 14 nays.
There being 22 ayes and 14 noes, the motion is agreed to. H.R. 807 as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House of Representatives. This meeting is adjourned.